Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, Episode 8. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all of our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Dr. Joel Wuthnow, a senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs within the Institute for National Strategic Studies at National Defense University. His research focuses on Chinese military affairs, strategic developments in East Asia, Chinese foreign and security policy, and U.S.-China relations. Joel also is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. His recent books and monographs include Gray Dragons, Assessing China's Senior Military Leadership, Crossing the Strait, China's Military Prepares for War with Taiwan, and The PLA Beyond Borders, Chinese Military Operations in Regional and Global Context. Joel, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. Now, as always with our guests on the podcast, we like to talk a little bit about what brought you through your life's journey into becoming an expert in this specific field. I mean, surely there's an explanation for how someone grew up in America and ended up studying the military of China. So walk us through the quick version of what brought you to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much, Steve, for the chance to be here on the podcast. It's been a bit of a long journey for me to get into sort of China and Chinese military subjects. Went to China for the first time 30 years ago now, amazingly, as a school student, and just was fascinated by the country. It was a puzzle, it was a mystery, and it was exciting. It's so different. Picked it up again in college, picked up the language a little bit. Lived over in China for about 2 years in the early 2000s, just again, fascinated with the country, with the politics, with U.S.-China relations. Went to graduate school, focused more on Chinese diplomacy, of all things, in the United Nations. I wrote a book on that. Didn't get into Chinese military subjects until about 2012 or so when I came to D.C. and worked for a place called the Center for Naval Analyses. So they were doing a lot of work for DOD, and so had me kind of dig into the PLA, which I thought was fascinating in its own right, in part because it's so opaque. It's hard to understand. It's a puzzle, and you never really feel as though you fully resolve the puzzle, but it's interesting, and they keep throwing you different surprises. So it's been just sort of an interesting intellectual exercise to get smarter on this. And then, of course, the obvious stakes and consequences now for the United States for regional stability and so on. Nothing could be, frankly, more important now, I think, for us to understand China, its strategic direction, and the PLA as an institution. So that's me in a nutshell, Steve.
That's outstanding. Well, before we jump into some of the substance, I'm always fascinated with the journey that we as individuals who focus on China to some degree go through. You mentioned going to live in China a couple of different times with different circumstances. Talk a little bit about what some of your thoughts were about what you thought you were getting into and what some of your key takeaways were from that real life experience. And what's changed in your assessment from what you saw and lived then to what you're seeing today?
Well, we're now 10 years into Xi Jinping's China, and it's almost hard to imagine a time before Xi Jinping. So that was really my direct interaction with China back in the 1990s, early 2000s. It was a totally different context. And so you could, at that time, actually go there as an American and have real frank, candid conversations with Chinese, both on the street and in the universities and the think tanks. What are they thinking? What is really behind their policy? And really kind of do in-depth interviews and make your research better. So it was an exciting and it was a different, kind of era in China's own development in terms of their civil society, the conversations they can have. In Xi Jinping's China, so much has changed. It's much harder for me now as a scholar, number one, to go there at all, and number two, to have real, frank, honest conversations with Chinese face to face or in terms of what they're writing. So it's actually much harder, I think, to get China, to understand them. It's much harder to access them, almost as if we're going back in some way to the Mao era, where you can't go there, you can't really talk to them, and you have to kind of detect different signals based on what they're doing, and other things like that. So a lot has changed, not necessarily for the better, but it is a challenge for us, I think, as analysts.
Well, I agree completely that Xi Jinping has been a pivotal variable in trying to understand what China is in the People's Republic, and what its role is and how it engages with outsiders like American government and civil society and academics. Is there, what you talk a little bit about what your sort of evolution of outlooks were on looking at China? You know, people often think of those who have sort of the missionary impulse or looking to kind of bring people into the light, whether that is free markets or free thought or free faith or whatever the ideal may be. But there was always this notion for decades that through engagement, our differences could narrow and areas of cooperation could expand. Xi Jinping clearly has changed that calculus for a lot of people. But was there anything that was sort of in your experience where you thought, this was kind of a desire to personally engage and understand? But then you sort of came to a realization of, I'm dealing with a really different and tougher animal than I first bargained for. That was my own experience, and maybe that of a few others. But how was that similar or different for you?
Well, I don't think I was ever so optimistic as to say that contact between China and the West would somehow liberalize China or turn them into a democracy. And my experiences with them was all after 1989 Tiananmen, when that dream was really just sort of snuffed out, I think, for the average Chinese, and they never really looked back. I don't think. I think there are certain arguable benefits of engagement and having a stable relationship with China that go beyond, sort of liberalization and democratization. But I think the benefits are more, well, what kind of China would we want to have that's integrated into the global economy and into, international markets and so on? Does that in itself, maybe it doesn't make them like us, but does that make them less warlike? Does that make them less hostile? And I think there is probably some evidence over the last couple decades that, at least from their point of view, they're trying to balance a couple different things. So, yes, they want greater say in the international system. They want to resolve territorial disputes on their own right, but they also still seem to value stability. Not because it's a good thing in its own right, but because that's necessary for their own internal development, for their own economic development, and for the CCP. So for the party, they kind of have to deliver the goods for their own people, right? They're, in a way, they're populists. They're telling their own people, look, with the party in charge, you're going to have a better life. You're going to do better for yourselves. We're going to clean up the environment. We're going to clean up corruption and all this. And so they still kind of have to deliver some of the goods, I think, for the people. And having a stable regional and global context for them, I think, is part of that equation. And so, again, they're sort of balancing these two different impulses. One is to be stronger, more confident, more in charge, but then also not to rock the boat so much that they're in open conflict and warfare with everyone kind of all at once. And so I think from that perspective, there's still some value in engagement and not in completely, let's say, decoupling from China or isolating or pushing them back to where they were in the 1950s when they were in open warfare with the United States. So I think engagement has a benefit, but it's not what some democratic peace theorists would argue maybe what it once could have been.
So, if we maybe dial in a little bit on the notion of stability from the People's Liberation Army's point of view or the Communist Party of China's point of view, and we'll try to emphasize that angle because we're not really talking about stability in terms of what the average American probably sees or perceives, given that what they're seeing in news headlines would seem to show a China under Xi Jinping that is perfectly willing to bark at American diplomats, to challenge rules and norms, maybe mislead international organizations, whether it's from the World Health Organization or different approach to human rights and things like that, and sanctions regimes that it might bristle under. So how it perceives stability or its role is probably very different than what Americans would bring to the table. So can you talk a little bit about if we're looking at the mindset of China's military leadership and the very different system that China under the Communist Party has of really a political leadership that is in charge of the military, than a military that's kind of on top of the state, and what kind of a stability they're really looking at. Some people might call it a balance of terror, in a way, of being able to do such awful things that people sue for peace or make a deal. And they certainly have shown a willingness to do that to the Chinese people. But talk a little bit about what they think stability looks like for them.
Well, again, what I think they're aiming for is a bit of a balance between stability in terms of lack of open conflict or warfare, at least today. And again, doesn't necessarily hold for 5 or 10 years from now, but at least from today's perspective. But sort of balancing that lack of warfare on one hand, but also making real progress on some of their territorial interests, on their resource interests, and in terms of standing up diplomatically kind of on the regional and international stage. So if you're in the region, you're looking at what China's doing, it doesn't necessarily look like necessarily a peace-loving or totally benign rising power. I mean, a lot of what they're doing looks completely provocative. And so just for example, now in the last 6 months or so, we've had a couple different sort of mini crises across the Taiwan Strait where the PLA has been very active. They've been, sailing and conducting exercises all around the island. They've been flying much closer to Taiwan than they used to and so on. And if you're sitting on that island, that looks extremely bellicose. And it makes people ask questions. Is this the prelude to a wider conflict? But from the Chinese point of view, this is a careful balancing act. They're trying to send signals. They're trying to intimidate. They're trying to get more of their agenda accomplished, but also not rock the boat so much that they're getting into a war that they don't think they're ready for or don't really want to pursue right now with the United States, which is really in the backdrop of all of these sort of regional disputes. And so that balancing act, a lot of people talk about that as sort of gray zone coercion. They're doing things that, we're not necessarily doing, Europeans aren't necessarily doing, Japanese, et cetera, as other great powers. But they go beyond that, but that are also not at the level of the kind of open warfare that we had during the Cold War. So again, it's a bit of a balancing act. They're trying to get as much of their agenda as possible, but without stepping over certain thresholds that are going to lead them into real risks and costs.
Well, Joel, you mentioned a concept of stepping into a war for which they're not ready yet. And so could you maybe apply some of your study and expertise to how should an everyday person look at what China's military strengths and weaknesses are? Where are they on this journey towards having options where they feel like they can impose their will versus having to balance, as you say, they may be trying to do at the current state?
Well, the PLA right now is a very modern force, and we shouldn't underestimate their capabilities. The way they're talking about it is that they think that they're still relatively behind, at least behind the gold standard of the United States. They're on kind of a long-term path to develop what they call world-class forces by the middle of the century. So they're often very critical of themselves. They critique themselves for not having good enough people, good enough training, good enough hardware, and so on. But as American military analysts looking at them, I think we wouldn't necessarily think of themselves in such a negative light. And there are a lot of different examples of this in terms of some of the hardware they're building. Just look at some of their surface ships. They have the world's largest navy now by tonnage. Some of their more advanced destroyers and cruisers are, in my view, every bit as capable of what the U.S. Navy has to offer. They're fielding now aircraft carriers. They have very advanced submarines. The list just goes on and on. And so when they talk about world-class military as a mid-century target, from my point of view, they're already quite world-class today here in 2023. I think the difference, though, is that China's military is really a regional power. This is where their posture, this is what they're trying to accomplish, is intimidate regional rivals and Taiwan and so on. They're not a global military like the United States has been ever since the end of World War II. So they don't really have the same network of overseas bases. They don't have forward deployed forces. They don't have military alliances. They don't have the architecture of a real global military. And so I think that's probably the areas where they're weakest. But it's also a bit of a strength insofar as if you're a regional military, you can consolidate all your best stuff within the region, right? And so the US, we're a global military, but if we're going to fight in Asia, then we're dispersed globally. And so it's much harder, I think, for us to concentrate our global military there to the region as China is able to do today.
I'll maybe talk about another wrinkle when we think about the People's Liberation Army or China's sort of comprehensive national power as another way of putting it. One thing that's very, very different about the People's Liberation Army from, say, the United States military is that China can use all of its avenues for influence and engagement around the world for whatever purpose its national leadership chooses. And so there's a pretty significant gray zone between commercial port access and commercial vessels and what could be potentially used for military or other purposes. When we talk about personnel and investments in the Belt and Road or whatever else, these could be humanitarian or commercial, but they also could be outposts that are relevant to projecting national power militarily if you needed to. And they obviously have jumped ahead when it comes to their space programs or their aspirations, at the very least, and in technology. So they certainly have a global footprint when it comes to an economic presence, a technological presence, increasingly a political presence. So maybe with sort of notions of hybrid warfare or just the unusual structure of what China's national leadership is under the Communist Party, how does that factor into what we look at in terms of the China military or strategic challenge versus the classic kind of national defense university kind of look at, here's an order of battle, here's the number of ships, here's the number of soldiers. In some ways, in China, we're dealing with a different animal than that classical approach, correct?
I think that's right. I think, when we look at different categories of national power, China is more of a heavyweight in some of the other areas that you highlighted there globally. So if we talk about sort of manipulation of international information through social media manipulation and so on, U.S. government doesn't really do that. That's sort of an illicit thing to do, to try to go into societies and manipulate their internal discourse, including here in the United States, right? To try to manipulate our own internal conversations to drive wedges within our own population, something that they are out and about trying to do. In terms of economics, they are funneling, or at least at the start of the Belt and Road Initiative, they funneled massive amounts of state funding into particular projects that U.S. firms would consider boondoggles, really, in some cases, but because some of them were strategic. Not to say that all of those projects are purely, military Trojan horses, but some of them seem to kind of be leaning in that direction or have other intelligence gathering purposes and things of this nature. I think that's certainly something that's worth considering. From a military lens, I think what I worry about less than, let's say, a global deployable PLA is actually the ability of the Chinese government to reduce our own access and our own military influence overseas. And that's really more of an economic and diplomatic piece, right? So when you have governments who we would rely on for basing, for access, for overflight, and so on in our future military operations, some of those countries are really heavily indebted to the Chinese. They have strong trade relations, and it gives China leverage, right? So let's say in the past when we, after 9/11, needed access to a number of Central Asian countries to go into Afghanistan and so on, we got it. Could we rely on that today, given the fact that China is the dominant trading partner and investment partner of all of those countries? Probably not. And so China's ability and potential willingness to limit our own global military operations via those sorts of tools of national power, to me, that's the more worrisome thing than to say China is going to open up a new logistics hub in Equatorial Guinea or something like that, that from a military perspective might not be very consequential at all.
Well, I think that's a really important concept where you have a military, if there's political will driving it, where it can quite easily do things that disrupt, break, confuse, otherwise thwart. That's cheaper and easier than trying to conduct some kind of a sophisticated military operation to take a territory or control an outcome. And that maybe the same concept can apply to their hardware platforms as well. If their objective is to strike an aircraft carrier to disable it, that's a heck of a lot cheaper and easier than to develop your own carrier battle group squad to be able to go out and cover the seven seas. So, am I capturing a correct concept that the PLA really has been looking at ways to shortcut, maybe overcoming America's deterrent capability without having to actually overcome America's military advantages? I mean, after all, the PLA really only has experience in killing Chinese people. It doesn't have active military experience in the modern era taking on a real sophisticated military foe, but it sure as heck can do on the cheap this disruption exercise that could increase deterrence and thwart our efforts. Is that about right?
I think that is about right. I think, for China to succeed in terms of their military strategy, they don't need to look exactly like us, and they don't need to do exactly what we're able to do globally. Right. So if you think, just for example, in special operations, we had the famous raid against Osama bin Laden a dozen years ago now. The PLA doesn't need to do that. They're not being tasked to do that, and they can't do that. What they're being tasked to do is to try to make progress on their territorial interests. Ultimately, the main scenario, of course, is one day reunifying one way or another with Taiwan. And the main obstacle to that, of course, is potential U.S. intervention on behalf of Taiwan. So what you need to do there, if you're the PLA, and they've been thinking about this for 20 to 30 years now, is how do you simply stop the United States from intervening? What are the key links and centers of gravity in the U.S. system of systems, right? There's a lot of jargon, but really what it means is, what is the U.S. relying on to get into the fight? So the U.S. is relying on satellites that can be taken down. We're relying on aircraft carriers that can be targeted. We're relying on logistics hubs and logistics computer networks to sustain and mobilize those forces. And so if you're China, what you want to have is a very competent cyber force, counter space force, and very good long-range missile forces. And they've built all of that. So that's really where they're excelling the most. It's not in terms of deploying, exquisite troops overseas to do really high-end joint operations. They're still kind of behind on that. But if you're talking about defeating, and by means of defeating, potentially deterring the U.S. from wanting to get involved in that fight in the first place, I think that's where they've put a lot of their eggs. And now recently, so that's been sort of the conventional side of the picture. More recently, what we're seeing from the PLA is a huge nuclear buildup as well. And so you can ask the question, well, what's that about? Why are they building, just for example, now the same number or in excess of the number of land-based nuclear warheads that we have? So what purpose does that serve for them? And what I would argue is that fits hand in hand with a deterrent strategy. They're saying, look, the United States is ultimately deterrable. Politically, we don't really want to get involved in a fight over Taiwan, or at least some people in the United States can be warded off of that pretty easily. And if you're the PLA, having a large nuclear arsenal gives you options to say, look, things could get really ugly for you very quickly. The U.S. homeland itself could be targeted, and not just U.S. military forces in the Western Pacific. And so I think that's one of the reasons why they're building that. And frankly, I think one of the lessons they're taking out of the current conflict in Ukraine, where President Putin did that at the start of the conflict, using the nuclear card to say, U.S., NATO, stay out of this. It's not your war. I think the Chinese are looking at it and they're saying, that actually might work for us too. So, our best bet, if you're the PLA, is not actually to fight the Americans in the first place. It's actually to politically deter the United States from making the decision to intervene. And you can do that in part through nuclear intimidation. So I think that's really kind of what they're doing right now.
I think those are some really important observations that would be worthy of milling over for a bit. But I want to shift gears just a little bit to dive back into some of your observations of what people might read about in headlines. There's been some talk about these joint military exercises that China has participated in recent months and years. In your assessment, what do you think the benefit is to China from joining in these exercises, say with Russia, Iran, and maybe some others?
Well, China is extracting a couple different benefits from these exercises. So with the Russians, first of all, they're learning. If you're an advanced military that has combat experience, which the Russians do, you're learning from them, right? Because the United States military right now is not engaging with the PLA, right? So this is not like the 80s and 90s when we did all manner of engagements with the PLA and they were learning from us. Now they are turning their attention more towards the Russian because they're offering them insight into what a modern military that at least has some joint combat experience. So they're gaining lessons learned by means of those exercises. But it's not just that. I don't think it's even primarily just that. I think it's more shaping the international information environment. I think what this is doing is it showcases a kind of solidarity between China and Russia that may actually even overstate the level of cooperation and alignment between the two countries. And they do disagree on certain things, and their interests are not fully aligned. But when they're militarily exercising, it looks scarier to a foreign audience. It looks like these are countries that might actually go to war together at some point in the future on some issue. When they're exercising with Iran, that looks like they're a military ally of Iran. When they're exercising with other countries like Pakistan, so what this does is it's regional shaping. It's shaping perceptions. It's causing other countries to say, "Look, China has friends, and those friends might come to their aid at some point in the future." Now, how much of that is real? How much of that is really just sort of media manipulation? I would say to some degree it's a bit of the latter. I don't think we should necessarily put too much stock into this. Frankly speaking, I don't think the Russians would help China very much militarily in a Taiwan scenario, just as the Chinese are really kind of holding off, or they're still somewhat holding off in supporting the Russians in Ukraine. I don't think China would go to war for Iran in Iran, given China's other equities in the Middle East. But perceptions matter here. And so if we think of China as having more friends, having more influence than perhaps it actually does, then that maybe has some dissuasive or even deterrent effect for a foreign audience.
Well, I think that there's a really important wrinkle in the Chinese thinking and approach to military and global politics than what we would think of from an American point of view or from the West. Even though one could make the case that the West used to do these things well and seems to have turned in a different direction in recent decades, but it's political warfare. I mean, this participation in these military exercises sends a political signal to the world or key actors out in various regions. It also sends a political signal to their own people. And so, can you talk a little bit about, maybe some of the similarities, but merely the differences in your research? I think maybe even in Gray Dragons, you got into some of this about looking at the senior military leadership. What are the notable differences between U.S. military leadership and thinking maybe along these lines and China's military leadership? Because I would argue that this political warfare and information warfare component is taken much more seriously and arguably is more effective in a Chinese strategic context than it is on ours.
Well, one of the major differences, I think, between the PLA and the U.S. military is that in terms of their leadership, half of their officers are political officers. I mean, fully half. If you look down the structure of the PLA all the way from the very top, the Central Military Commission down through the ranks, at each echelon of the PLA, you have a commander and a political officer making decisions together, collectively. Political officers have a lot of different functions, but, bread and butter, what they do is what you might call political warfare. So this is about, not only about foreign projection of Chinese strength, where perhaps maybe it isn't quite so strong, it's also about internal political work. So making sure that the rank and file, the troops are fully on the same page as party center. And so if we look just, for example, comparing this with the Russians, the Russian military didn't take political work quite as seriously. So they never had the same level of political commissars as the Chinese do. Chinese political indoctrination goes on all the time. It's maybe a quarter of troop training time. So politics is really, it's just integral to the DNA of the PLA. So if it's sort of foreign political work or internal morale building work, that's something that they take very seriously. I think where we excel, and this is not to sort of denigrate or to cast aspersions on our own system, I think where we excel is really in terms of operational expertise. So if you look at U.S. four-stars, just look at their biographies. They have tremendous amounts of foreign experience, foreign tours of duty, real combat experience, joint experience, and so on. These are really impressive people who make it up to that level. In the PLA, to make it up to the very top, you certainly need to be loyal. You need to be personally compliant to Xi Jinping. You don't need to have combat experience because no one has combat experience. And you don't need to be joint qualified because they don't have that kind of a system in the PLA. It's all service centric, right? So in the PLA, you're a very good group army commander. You know the infantry very well, but you don't know how to lead a joint campaign, which is the essence of modern warfare. So, in the political dimension, morale, propaganda, these sorts of things, I think they take that stuff really seriously. In our system, we don't do so much political indoctrination of the force or anything like this so much, but we do operations really, really well. And we have a lot of foreign and combat experience. And I think that's kind of where our cachet lies.
So when you take a look back at your journey and diving into the People's Liberation Army and just looking at China's strategic role changing a bit from a specialist point of view to a more general audience, what do you think that we in the United States or the West generally understand the least well? And sort of flip it over, what do you think the other side really doesn't quite get about us?
Well, I think, if we're looking at our own, sort of assessment of the situation, I think we get hardware the best. Things that we can count, things that we can analyze. If we look at, we do this all the time, looking at the range rings of missiles and things like this, the kinetic piece, I think we get that, we do that pretty well. If we're looking at kind of the softer side of things, the more ambiguous qualitative dimensions of military operations, getting the PLA, it's much, much harder. And I think it's because they have this Byzantine organizational culture. They talk in ways that don't really make sense to us. And they have, systems like the political commissar system that have no cognate in our system. So getting our heads around this kind of stuff, understanding why it matters, understanding what implications that would have in a war, it's very, very difficult to catalog those sorts of things. From the PLA, I think, they have a similar kind of, maybe a similar sort of bias that they get our equipment pretty well. I think they try to understand our organization and our doctrine pretty well. They seem to want to copy a lot of it. But ultimately, I don't think that they really fully understand what makes us effective, which is being willing to empower individuals in the military. So being able to say, look, the commander has a certain intent, but you lower level guys, you're going to figure out how to implement that. If something awry happens, you're going to be empowered to adapt on the battlefield and make rapid decisions. The PLA has never been comfortable thinking like that. Because what they prize is centralized decision making, collective decision making, and it's much more cumbersome. And so, being willing to kind of let go of that Leninist apparatus, if you will, that legacy of the Red Army, it's something they haven't really been willing to fully embrace. And so, if they're not willing to do that, I think their ability to innovate, to adapt, to try new things, to respond to risk in creative ways, to get outside of their scripted exercises is really, really hard for them to be able to do that. And so I think that's really where the difference lies.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of intersecting trend lines that have been before my eyes over recent decades. One was sort of the collective estimates from government and private sector sources trying to measure the capabilities increase, the military modernization of China's strategic forces. Our estimates have consistently undercounted where the PLA ended up being. And so whether we're looking at timeline to be able to deploy a carrier or development of certain kinds of missiles, what have you, the best experts giving the best estimates they could routinely for like 2 decades underestimated how rapidly that would grow. And the pace with which China's nuclear arsenal was going to be growing and modernizing, actually getting tested, things like that, has been consistently underestimated. So there's one trend line where the West, in government and out of government, seems to have been behind where reality was with the enhancement of China's strategic capabilities. Then another trend line, which is China's demographic curve bending significantly down from right around now going forward. Its economic curve sort of coming down to Earth's gravity to a degree, whether it's because of COVID-induced lockdowns or other kinds of things that happen. But the changing demographics of China will affect its economic engine. It will affect the pool from which even the PLA can recruit. So clearly, there are going to be some changes ahead that politics can't completely overcome. But can you talk about these two trend lines, whether you see them similarly or what role they play and how we should understand the thinking of the PLA? If we have this enhanced capability that seems to have outpaced our best estimates, that's pretty scary. This other one coming down may suggest time is actually more on our side. But then maybe there's an argument that says, well, right here is the sweet spot where we might be at maximum risk, where they have the economic power, they have the technological edge, they have the force. And so maybe we're in a period of vulnerability, but that's a lot to throw at you from two curves and an intersection. But with that verbal map, how do you see those kinds of trends, and how should that inform our thinking about China's capabilities and where they're going?
Well, first of all, I don't think that we should underestimate their ability to do impressive things very quickly in their system. So, I'm not sure why we would be surprised by the pace or the extent of their progress, especially over the last 10 years or so. Personally, I wouldn't have made those predictions. But where we are, I think, is that they are, now routinely, I mean, just year over year, if we look at just for example, DOD publishes an annual report on the Chinese military that, has to update its assessments about the size of the nuclear forces and about the size of some of the most modern air and naval assets and so on. I think the reason for that fundamentally is because they operate in a system that has less red tape. I mean, they're able to cut through some of that stuff, especially in the Xi Jinping era, where there's less, I think, ability by the PLA to say, we're going to continue to do business as usual. But they don't have the same kind of legislative oversight. They don't have the same level of, civil military, interactions that we have in our system, where things, proceed along this very plodding rate. And that's true of, most Western civil military relations, where you have a lot of checks and balances. And so it's a good and a bad thing, right? Because you can do bold things. You can also do bold but very bad things as well, precisely because there's not a lot of oversight. But I think, the point remains, though, that they are building a lot of really impressive things very quickly, that, we shouldn't understate it. Now, the other kind of dimension of this, has to do with, the negative trends for China's development and how they perceive these situations. So, certainly their economic growth is nowhere nearly where it was 15 years ago. They're in kind of the low to mid single digits. In terms of the demographic piece, they're facing a large population of retirees. And so they're going to have to think about some of those guns versus butter kinds of issues. I'm not sure how much that really influences their decision calculus on potentially using force against Taiwan, for example. Do they sense that they're in some sort of, period of opportunity right now? This has been known sometimes colloquially in our discourse as the Davidson window, the sort of mid to late 2020s. There's this period of opportunity for them. I'm not sure that that's how they actually perceive themselves. I think I see that more as an argument that Western analysts have made and have almost foisted that on the Chinese as if that's how they're thinking. When the Chinese themselves talk about their own national trajectory, they seem to be very optimistic about the long term. They're building towards national rejuvenation by 2049. They seem to think that their own system of governance is much more coherent and resilient than the West, which seems to be, incoherent and declining from their point of view. So I'm not sure that they themselves are in some sort of a peak period where it's kind of now or never with respect to the use of force. So I haven't been totally persuaded by that argument. But from their point of view, I think if they are ever going to use force, I think it certainly will be conditions based. It will be not some arbitrary period in time when they think, oh, now's the time. No, I think it will depend very much so on the political conditions. So where do they sense Taiwan is? Do they think that this is the only last and best option to do this? I don't think it's going to be because they think that in 5 or 10 years their demographic picture looks worse or something like this. I don't think that's connected very well to the way they think about military decision making, especially on the Taiwan issue.
Well, let's dive into the Taiwan issue a little bit, since it also is one of those things that has dominated headlines. Some of us who've spent our lives in this combination of things, Asia, China, and Taiwan, bristle at the idea of Taiwan being talked about as a subset of China policy. And yet it seems inevitable that any conversation about China comes back to a Taiwan contingency, and media coverage seems to highlight the risk of conflict. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw as significant or insignificant in the reactions to the Speaker Pelosi visit to Taiwan last summer, and then President Tsai's visit with Speaker McCarthy in California just recently? In both cases, we had some unusual reaction by the People's Liberation Army and some strategic communications that were not exactly warm and fuzzy from Beijing's diplomats. But talk through a little bit about what you see as significant or less significant takeaways from watching those two scenarios.
I think in a nutshell, what I sort of perceived from the Chinese was calculated risk in terms of their responses. And what I mean by that is that, they did do new things. So they scaled up their response, certainly compared to back in 1995, 1996, they were responding to a similar provocation from their point of view by the United States. But their response then was very small scale exercises. They lobbed a couple of missiles near to the ports. 2022, 2023, what we saw was a much larger level of effort by the PLA in terms of the number of jets they were sending across the midline of the Taiwan Strait. They were demonstrating the fact that they could operate their naval forces all around the island and not just close to their own coasts. They fired missiles not only near, but actually over Taiwan. So they did things that were designed, I think, specifically to send a message to Taiwan and the United States that, more will be coming if you go down this road. On the other hand, though, the reason why I call this calculated risk is because there are also things that they could have done, but they didn't do. Right. So they didn't actually try to, force down Nancy Pelosi's jet. They didn't really, dust things up kinetically. They didn't try to, and in the latest incident, what they were talking about initially was maybe we're going to try to even inspect and board Taiwan ships in the Taiwan Strait, which would have been extremely provocative. But they backed away from that. And so they did things that I think they thought they could control. So they were, sending jets in certain places, ships and so on, but they weren't really encountering or intercepting or coming into, direct engagement with any foreign forces. And so from that perspective, I think they were trying to limit the chance that this would really blow up into something that they wouldn't be able to handle. And then I guess the question is, did it work? So, the fact that they had this, sort of risky but moderately risky response to the U.S. and Taiwan, has that worked? Maybe to some degree. I mean, I think, in terms of, Kevin McCarthy's encounter with Tsai, that was in California. It was designed to be relatively low key. He didn't go to Taiwan. Does that show that the August and September provocations worked? Maybe, maybe not. Taiwan seemed to not want him to do that. And then with respect to Taiwan and where they are politically, is this going to shape the outcome of their 2024 presidential election? I would say at this point it's too soon to tell. The polls still seem to show the more pro-independence leaning candidate running ahead of the candidates that China would prefer. And so if that pans out, then that would look more like 1996 when China did all this provocation and it kind of pushed the guy they didn't want right into office. And so, I think it's too soon to know whether that's actually going to be the outcome. But I'm not sure that, from their point of view, any of this was fully successful. And the reason for that is precisely because they tried to limit the risk. And so if you're an observer looking what the Chinese did, you're saying, well, they did all this stuff, but they really didn't, entertain open warfare with us. That shows that they're kind of risk averse. And so from that point of view, are you going to moderate your own behavior? And so I'm not sure that this was the best outcome for China. And so I worry in the future, if they think this has all failed, what's next? What do they think they're going to need to be prepared to do in the next crisis or the next perceived provocation from Taiwan and the United States? And that's where I think we need to worry more about higher levels of risk to send a stronger signal.
Well, at least in terms of cause and effect, hopefully they've been able to notice that in this latest round of things, the cumulative effect has been that engagement with Taiwan has been more bipartisan. And the number of members of Congress that have flooded to visit Taiwan has dramatically increased over recent months. Now, some of that is pent up interest and demand after a couple of years of COVID shutdowns. But really, since the provocations surrounding the Pelosi visit, we've had a dramatic increase in the number of governors, former cabinet members, and members of Congress of several different committees of jurisdiction going. So if they meant to dissuade interest in Taiwan by American thought leaders and political leaders, that part hasn't worked terribly well. But as we sort of wind down to the latter phase of our conversation, how about maybe sharing what you see as what a crisis or a conflict in the Taiwan Strait might look like? This is the dominant scenario that anyone looking at the Chinese military has to contemplate over and over and over. Has many different layers to it. But in the broadest sense, what should Americans be thinking about and be aware of? What the consequences of a conflict with China over Taiwan would look like?
Well, this is something the PLA has been working on since the early 1990s. Recently it's the case that our Department of Defense has started to refer to Taiwan as the pacing scenario, which is interesting because for the PLA, this has been their pacing scenario for 25, 30 years. So they haven't not given this any thought. What a conflict would look like. We don't know exactly whether this would be, so there are kind of two different versions of this. One is, colloquially, we call this boil the frog. So ratchet things up until you get the outcome that you want. So you may, start with some kind of a limited blockade and then go to a higher level full quarantine of the island. And then you start lobbing missiles and then you send the troops across the strait. So that's one alternative. It's problematic because it gives the U.S. time to intervene. That's the main problem with that. And the other alternative is really, sort of a strategic surprise. You want to try to get everything all over and done with all at once. You want to stun and paralyze U.S. decision-making, isolate Taiwan, very quickly get across the strait and control the territory. And so I think that's apparently what President Putin was trying to do a year plus ago in Ukraine, totally failed, and now he's in a protracted war. I think from the Chinese point of view, it's ideal if you think that you can keep the U.S. out of the fight, if you can do a very quick sort of fait accompli using your amphibious and your airborne forces, just get it all done with, have it be a very big surprise, and therefore limit the cost and the risk militarily. So, which of those alternatives or paths it is, I don't know. I don't think anyone really has a clear concept, of what it's going to look like for the PLA. For the United States, it's really hard to say as well. It depends on our level of engagement. It depends on how much we're involved. As I was saying earlier, I do think that the Chinese are starting to think more about the idea that the U.S. ultimately can be deterred. But how do you do that? Do you actually have to, create nuclear risks risks of nuclear escalation? Do you have to conduct cyber strikes? That's something that's been in the press of late. The idea that the Chinese will try to take down our power grid or our water supply, or this kind of thing. Are they going to do that? In which case, there would be an immediate material impact on our way of life. Is this something where we would restrain ourselves and say, look, we'll try to maybe resupply you or supply you with intelligence, and that's going to be about it? I don't know, but I think it would depend very much on the decision by the president about how much you're willing to do in terms of your intervention on behalf of Taiwan. And for the Chinese, from their point of view too, this isn't to portray them as a sort of indomitable figure. They have their own risk calculus. They don't want to be in a war with the United States. I mean, that would be a strategic blunder of the highest magnitude from an economic point of view, even from a military point of view. If they really get into it, look at Pearl Harbor of all things. So that's not necessarily where they want to be. But in a Taiwan circumstance where they're really boxed into the corner, I think their best bet is to try to do what they can to keep us out of it. And that could mean, seriously targeting, our homeland for the point of view of deterring U.S. intervention. So there are definitely real risk involved for us as well as for them.
Well, it's a scary scenario, but unfortunately one we have to contemplate because, as Matt Pottinger, a former Deputy National Security Advisor, said before a congressional committee recently, sometimes when a hostile force keeps telling you the same thing over and over and over, maybe you need to begin to listen to what they say. Mm-hmm. And so we have to look at this scenario. Now, Joel, before we wind to a conclusion, where can our audience find you and best follow your work?
Yeah, they can follow me on Twitter. If you just search for my handle at JWUTHNOW, you can find me right there. Or you can Google my name and find me on the National Defense University website.
Excellent. Well, to our audience, if you enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Joel Wuthnow for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.